A very good afternoon and welcome to this exclusive Fintelekt webinar on combating illegal wildlife trade, a very important area of concern globally. My name is Shirish Pathak, I head Fintelekt, and it's my pleasure to be your host today. Wildlife trade and trafficking is not just an environmental issue. Its consequences are not confined to depletion in wildlife habitats or extinction of species. Multiple studies across the world provide evidence that perpetrators of wildlife trafficking are linked to transnational organized criminal activity, corruption, and terrorism. While governments, wildlife departments, and NGOs in the sector are doing their bit, the low risk, high reward illegal wildlife activities can be further curtailed if money flows associated with this type of trade are actually disrupted. It is important, therefore, for banks and financial institutions to monitor and detect wildlife trade related suspicious activities. A collaborative approach and information sharing are the need of the hour to help track down networks or syndicates that illegal wildlife traders are associated with. On the webinar today, we will be speaking with one such agency that has a global footprint and is demonstrating some encouraging results in combating illegal wildlife trade. I have with me Robert Campbell, Program Manager at United for Wildlife. Led by the Duke of Cambridge and the Royal Foundation, United for Wildlife works to tackle illegal wildlife trade by bringing together conservation organizations, governments, and global corporations to address the pressing conservation challenges of today and to work to prevent endangered species from going extinct. In 2019, United for Wildlife launched the Financial Taskforce to engage financial institutions in this effort and to identify specific actions that can be taken by the financial sector. I will discuss with Rob the priorities and mission of United for Wildlife, disrupting money flows associated with the illegal wildlife trade, the urgent need to create greater awareness about the issue, and most importantly, how banks can contribute in the fight against the illegal wildlife trade. Rob, thank you for joining this webinar today. It's indeed a pleasure to have you here. So we have been following with great interest and respect the work of United for Wildlife in the last few years, especially since the launch of the Financial Taskforce, which is expected to help disrupt money flows in the fight against the illegal wildlife trade. Can you take our listeners through the journey of UFW, its inspiration and mission?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you for having me, and I'm happy to talk about the task force and what we're trying to do. To give you some context into the background of why we're doing it, this slide shows some of the statistics in the background. The fact that the illegal wildlife trade is valued between $7 and $23 billion, and that makes it the fourth largest black market trade, after arms, human trafficking, and narcotics trafficking. And some of the statistics you'll see up there. For animals killed, but really, the illegal wildlife trade is governed by an organization, CITES, I guess, and the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. They write what is an endangered species and what isn't, and we're seeing, I think there's roughly 1,600 species on their critically endangered list. And actually, since those lists have been active, only 2% have ever recovered. 2% of species have ever recovered enough to be removed from that list. So it's quite a grey picture that a lot of these animals are dying and species are being wiped out. Fueling this, being fueled by the illegal wildlife trade. And as you can see, the statistic at the bottom, in the last 50 years, we're looking at 60% of the world's wildlife. So that's flora and fauna has been lost. So we're at a stage where it's critically important to start doing something. And up to this stage, conservation efforts to save these animals and things has not really worked. I think we can be honest and say that the numbers suggest that the conservation efforts are not. We need more to support that. So the idea for the United for Wildlife is to really bring in the private sector. So we're quite fortunate. We have His Royal Highness the Duke of Cambridge as our president, and the ex-Foreign Secretary for the UK, Lord William Hague, is our chairman. And they can use their convening power, their influence across global influence, really, to bring in the private sector to assist with this trade assist with combating the trade. So, with the Duke and Lord Hague, you have a neutral platform. It sits under the Royal Foundation, which is a charitable arm of say, Kensington Palace. We're not a government, we're not a private sector entity ourselves. There's no competitive nature for what we're doing. We're purely trying to leverage influence in bringing in the private sector to assist in combating the illegal wildlife trade. And there's a quote at the bottom, which is our sort of mission, to create a framework to assist the private sector in combating IWT in order to limit further loss of species. So we've been, the target really is the private sector. So we've aimed at the transport and financial sector. Transport because the trade has to move from source to destination, and typically that is going from Africa to Asia. That's not always the case, but typically that is what's happening. They're moving in such large volumes that it has to go on commercial trade. So much of this rhino horn, ivory, pangolin scales are moving on container shipping. You'll see the picture here, but they get filled up and they're often disguised or misdeclared on the bills of lading, and all of that. It moves on with regularity on mainline shipping routes. And the second part was bringing in the financial sector, because with the transport sector, if they have the right intelligence at the right time, they can often make a seizure at a certain point. But if they miss that junction, if the intelligence is late, if the right capability at the port is not quite there, if there is corruption involved, you've missed a real opportunity, and the wildlife has gone through. But with the finance side, you have an audit trail that you can go back on, and not only that, if in response to a seizure, you can start looking at, well, what account paid for that shipping container to move from here to there? What accounts was that money coming from? And you can start to map the wider criminal network that's associated with this. And that's the real important side of bringing the private sector in. The capability they bring, and the resources and sort of action is quite amazing. And so with those, we also target industry bodies. Those are associations and things like that. But also government. We've got a few government departments on the task forces, law enforcement, and the NGOs. Typically, the NGOs will provide the on-the-ground intelligence, that what is moving where, what does a suspicious package or transaction look like. It'll then go through the private sector, and then we feed into law enforcement. So on the financial task force, these are the members we have so far. We're growing rapidly. I think we've got just over 40 of some of the world's biggest banks. On the transport side, we've got about 130 members, so way too many to display a slide like this. But it's really promising. We're finding that this is something the private sector want to do, that it is within their remit. It's a financial crime, and therefore it's something they're keen to sort of get on top of. And it's also, if it's happening in regular financial infrastructures, using their banks because of the size of the trade, it's not hidden under the beds. This is going through, some of the big institutions, that they want to know what's moving through their systems, and if they can open themselves up to include additional intelligence to look at this, well, then that's what they want to do, and we've seen some really good results about that. So thank you.
Thanks, Rob, for that introduction. And just for the benefit of our listeners to understand more about your organization's fit in the entire ecosystem, how would you describe the actual ecosystem of anti-wildlife trafficking, and really where does UFW fit in?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if we look at this slide, let's see. So typically, like any trade, you're looking at the movement of a commodity for profit, and in this case, the commodity is illegal. So, but you've got a demand side, so that is, let's say Asia in general. You've got a demand side that enables a poaching incident, and it's the different sort of the way through commercial shipping or cargo airlines, and then it goes to point of destination, and then it's about distribution. And within that structure, within those sort of key points of any trade, you've got bottlenecks. The key bottlenecks for us is, if it is coming from Africa to Asia, well, it has to move out of a port or it has to move through an airport. That is cool. And those areas or geographies those bottlenecks are policed by law enforcement. And so improving awareness of wildlife trafficking, what does it look like coming through an airport? That's where you're going to try and impose seizures. And this is where the Financial Taskforce can come in as a primary effort, is that upon the seizure, you'll have seized the contents. You'll have probably a courier associated with that if you're lucky, but they're probably not that linked in with the operation, and they certainly won't have much information about the higher echelons of that criminal organization. And so what you can do is use the banks to say, well, that transaction sat with that account. Who has accounts with this? And you can talk to some of those banks on the logo slide I showed just a minute ago. They can run them through the systems and start mapping, who paid, where did the money come from there, and where did it come from? And soon enough, you'll build a picture of, sort of a tree of following the money of who's involved in this. And we have had significant success in order to get right to the top of the tree. And these people, this is brand new for wildlife trafficking. No one has ever been able to get to the top of the untouchables, if you will, the top of the criminal syndicates. And they have led, and in doing, because of that, it's a very low risk crime to them, extremely high returns, and we're seeing some incidents where other agencies, so maybe if they're looking at drugs trafficking, will look at wildlife trafficking as a soft underbelly to get to the drugs. So, criminals would often take a lot less risk with wildlife trafficking, and therefore, it's much more of an opportunity for us. And the third part of that sort of ecosystem really is the intelligence-led. It's not always about the seizures on the ground, but you will see a lot of NGOs in specific regions or countries will have a lot of information about, they'll know who the traffickers are, they'll know who the criminal syndicates are, but what they've struggled with in the past is there's not many people who can take up that information. And this is what we're trying to do with the Financial Taskforce, is with giving them an avenue to share that intelligence. So it's not just shared with law enforcement, it's also shared with the financial services, and they can then conduct their own investigations and start mapping out, how much of a priority this is, a big case, who are they linked to, and you might start to see some fairly impressive results.
Great. Rob, there was a recent report in the Telegraph which described the many achievements of the UFW in the last year. So firstly, many congratulations for the material impact that has been created. Could you take us through what the role of UFW has been and speak a bit about what happened last year?
Yeah, of course. So that article was actually written by the Duke of Cambridge and Lord Hague themselves, and these are some of the results I think they mentioned in the article.
Right.
But really, the role here, these are all law enforcement, tend to be certainly the bottom ones, law enforcement effects or impacts. But the task force has probably two roles here. One, firstly, it is about enabling the financial services industry and transport industry to better detect this, in an automatic, way, or automated way. So, if financial services can identify a suspicious transaction due to, the red flags that they've imposed or typologies that they will have on their systems, they can pick this stuff up without a following up to a seizure. They can, they might not need the intelligence from NGOs. If they have the frameworks in place to identify what is a suspicious transaction related to wildlife trafficking, they can start initiating these investigations themselves. And that is a massive, massive hindrance to criminals. And it's something that, 2 years ago was not really there. That wildlife trafficking, is just not understood at a financial level. the way it is starting to become now. And I think that's why we've got the interest of your members. And the second way I think the task force can be really impactful is law enforcement. More and more law enforcement are seeing the task force as an avenue to assist their investigations. So almost a corporate directory. So quite often they will come to us. So I'll give you this case at the bottom. A major transnational IWT network disrupted. That was this case here. So Prince William, obviously wasn't putting handcuffs on criminals, but this task force, was. And so we had US Fish and Wildlife Service and the Drugs Enforcement Agency from the US. As I said, the links to narcotics trafficking earlier. They were interested in this criminal network in East Africa, biggest sort of ivory, trafficking network there, and also significant heroin distribution network. They were interested in these guys, but they didn't have the financial investigation details, on hand, and they didn't have the links to the shipping sector and how all these things were moving. And so they came to the task force, and we put them in touch with, I think, about 6 or 7 banks and about 4 or 5 transport companies who assisted in the investigation. They carried out their own internal investigations and handed over to law enforcement, and then they worked together in building this case. And in the end, we're able to develop such a case against them that the 2 senior members of that syndicate were extradited to the United States, and they're sort of awaiting prosecution now. But this is the first time that wildlife trafficking has ever had a case so successful, that a multiple jurisdiction case. So this was operating across East Africa, not just one country, that where we've been able to have significant success. So this is a really good story of how the private sector, and I'd say, banking industry really can impact this sort of stuff. So it's really important that you've got those two. And this is, I'll just talk through, why this is important for financial services. So, there was a survey on the UNODC, and sort of, I think it was actually Asia Pacific survey, but, it uncovered that 86% of jurisdictions are affected by wildlife trafficking. And only 71% of those view it as a significant money laundering threat. Now, obviously, we're talking about billions of US dollars annually, and this stuff, trust me, gets laundered through regular financial systems. So, and then 26% of that, only 26% of that conduct financial investigations. And as you sort of wind down, you realize only 1% of those 86% wildlife, affected by wildlife trafficking, see a result of a serious prison penalty or sentence delivered. And that is shocking. If you were to look at narcotics trafficking or another form of trafficking, it just wouldn't be that level. And I think, with wildlife trafficking, that's why we're trying to raise awareness of it. It's not just about the money. I mean, we're also seeing, species becoming extinct. And so there was a real importance as to this, and a time frame to do it, because 10 years time there won't be any more elephants in the wild or rhinos in the wild. So the timing is important. And typically, as I said before, the links to drugs, but really the convergence with other crimes is, and this slide shows some of those. It's not, often the smuggling element, the criminals, they don't care what's in the box. It could be drugs, it could be ivory, it could be arms, it could be counterfeit goods. They don't care. They just move it. It's a profitable, it's a movement of a commodity for profit. They don't, and so these are we've in a number of investigations have revealed, a lot of these crimes are often linked with wildlife trafficking. So it's no surprise that you can use wildlife trafficking to get into an investigation when you're looking at fraud or counterfeiting or cybercrime or terrorist finance. There are, surprisingly enough, there are links to terrorist financing in Africa, where wildlife trafficking has been linked with that. So it's a big thing. And I think what we try and do is bring the financial members together to grow the network. That's about the awareness piece. It's embed IWT into their systems and training, and try and develop those red flags and automated systems so that they can detect it themselves. work together to developing expertise. So this is new for financial services. There are probably solutions we haven't seen or found yet that as an industry, they can bring a lot of influence and effect to what we're trying to do. And then, advocate this sort of effective end-to-end chain. So that's about, regulation, bringing wildlife trafficking into, the same context as narcotics trafficking or something like that. It's about, growing that. So, yeah, we're on the way, but there's still a lot of work to go yet.
Right. Thanks, Rob. So, Rob, in addition to these 4 areas, are there any other priorities of United for Wildlife that you would say are important for you in the near future?
Yes, and funnily enough, we've just released a new sort of strategy for our next 3 years. So we've decided, we've been with the Transport Task Force, we've been doing this for about 4 years, with the Financial Task Force about 1 year. And because the Duke of Cambridge has a number of commitments he's doing and other passions, we feel if we can't make significant headway in the next 3 years on this, then we're probably not doing it justly. So we've given ourselves 3 years to really maximize a surge in effort, a sort of a reach out to try and get as many financial institutions bought into this and to start contributing, to start seeing wildlife trafficking as a priority, as a financial crime, and start putting in the infrastructures and frameworks in place so that in 3 years' time, when we walk away, this is an automated system. This is seen as other forms of financial crime, maybe like we see, drugs in the 70s. We want to make it so that it is business as usual to all banks. And this is really, we kicked this off with a meeting at St. James's Palace, where the Duke spoke and President of Kenya, President Kenyatta, came and spoke. So we're really passionate about driving this forward. I think, the 3-year timeframe, the key really is to increase membership, increase capability, better links with the intelligence world about what's moving and when, and try and create some formal structure that makes this business as usual. So there is no role for me or United for Wildlife in 3 years' time. I want to make it so that it's what people come into work and it's part of their risk dashboard.
Excellent. That's fantastic, Rob. So in the next 3 years, if there's anything that Fintelekt can do to help spread your message more, we are here for you. My next question to you, Rob, is, in many of the developing countries, there is actually an urgent need to create awareness about wildlife trafficking and the illegal wildlife trade, not only among banks, but also among regulators and law enforcement agencies. So how is the task force supporting developing countries where presumably there would be lack of resources, there would be presence of corruption, and this really hinders the fight against trafficking? So are there any initiatives that United for Wildlife is taking around awareness generation and collaboration with agencies, especially in developing countries?
Yeah, that is a great question, and you're right. Corruption sits at the center of so much of this, and it's any form of trafficking is often facilitated by corruption, and it makes it so difficult to combat. And so solving corruption is one of the primary efforts. But in saying that, we are seeing results. I mean, I was in Johannesburg recently, setting up a regional capability for the task force, bringing the Southern African banks together to talk about solutions within that region, link them up with intelligence providers in the area. And while I was there, they released their rhino poaching statistics, and they were down, or they are down. So the numbers of rhinos poached in the last 2 years has dropped by 42%. And that is quite something staggering. It's not the full picture because we don't know exactly how many rhinos are left, but it's a significant improvement. And that's really down to a couple of things. The major one being corruption. Is the new president in South Africa has had a big stamp down on corruption in the area, and that has led to police headquarters or police offices around in the vicinity of some of the big parks becoming under much closer scrutiny, and we're seeing the impacts of that now. But it's also due. I spoke to a number of the on-site protection people there. Also due to because of private sector taking this up, as a more thoroughly. They're seeing the results of criminals being more cautious about how they bank their money. The supply chain is being disrupted, and that is exactly what we want to do. So tackling corruption is key, but also enabling banks and people, organizations to be more vigilant is probably better too. The other major thing I think that's relevant is the FATF. So I'm sure you're aware of the Financial Action Taskforce. They are the global standard for money laundering and terrorist financing. And just last year, they through some of our connections and maybe lobbying, they announced that wildlife trafficking would be one of their priorities, and this year. So the current president, who comes from China, which is another bonus, because I think China are starting to do a lot about this now, and it's great to have them taking the lead and pushing this forward themselves from the government perspective. But with FATF putting this as one of their priorities, we're immediately seeing a number of governments from countries that we struggle to sort of get to, put their head up and say, what is wildlife trafficking? We've got to get our heads around this, because soon enough we'll have to fill out a FATF questionnaire or report, and it looks like that is going to be a risk assessment on each country of wildlife trafficking. They're going to have to know what this is, and in doing that, you're spreading awareness across the country. You're putting pressure on governments to be more accountable for what's going on, to do with wildlife trafficking, and it will address that. I hope it will address that corruption issue, because senior government officials who've got to put their return into FATF each year have got to report on wildlife trafficking, something they've never done before. It's going to make it much more difficult for the corrupt element of that to facilitate the trade. And so, as I spoke about the US Fish and Wildlife case earlier, but really, that was a major success and something, we're really proud of. But really, it's things like this. It's regulatory changes and updates to systematic processes that are going to change the flow. And I think this is by far the biggest success that for potential, for its impact potential that the task force has got. And I think, I hope that we can, through initiatives like this, we can engage with some of those regulators and financial intelligence units from, some of the countries, that are developing countries or not as well resourced, and linking the banking sector up, with the financial intelligence unit to discuss wildlife trafficking. And, that's where we want to be getting to. We want everyone on a sort of open book, talking about this and having the connections to action when something does come down the chain.
Right. So, Rob, the signatories to the UFW Financial Task Force, some of the logos that you displayed earlier, is a very impressive list of global banks and financial institutions. How do you think more banks, especially from Asia, maybe some of the local or national banks from here, can join the fight? And what role do you think that these banks can really play at either a local or a regional level? Yeah, good question. I would love to open it up to and we are open up to all banks. We have a as you saw that list there, it's fairly international, but we're probably not that strong on banks in Asia. We've now got a few Chinese banks. We've Vietcom Bank were signed up first, very, very early on. And we've got a lot of, say, global banks like HSBC and Standard Chartered and Citigroup who obviously operate there. But we don't have that many local or national level banks. We do rely on say, some of the global banks' corresponding relationships to access that. But I think that, there's a lot more that could be done by targeting, as you say, the national and local level banks. And I think, we welcome them to join the task force. It's about raising awareness of the issue. The more local banks you have on
force or in an area, the more sort of soft power you might have for the government to do something about wildlife trafficking. You know, I think we've got a lot of events this year and certainly next year, but I hope to be out in Asia to do some more, you know, awareness raising or workshops out there. You know, we did something in Hong Kong in August last year, and it was really receptive. You know, we had a lot of banks come in, probably 70 or 80 people came together to sort of just get a better understanding of what is wildlife trafficking, what can they do. We linked them up with Hong Kong Customs and the British High Commission out there, just because that's where it was easy to facilitate from here. But I think, you know, there's a lot more that can be done, and typically the criminal element, you know, a lot of the initial investigation needs to start at the national level, a local level, because the criminals, you know, they don't use that level. They don't use standard chartered accounts or HSBC accounts. They use, you know, local banks. And so if we can enable those local banks to identify, you know, suspicious transactions, you know, slightly better, you know, by sharing some of the intelligence we have, you know, and it's free. We don't charge anything to join the task force. Everything is free. You know, we hope that, you know, they will be able to spot and report, you know, file STRs or SARs, report these things, and you know, we'll start seeing more action, and that's the key, you know. So I'm hopeful that, you know, we can get out there and push our membership in Asia. You know, this is, as I say, this is not a competitive space. We are, the Royal Foundation and United for Wildlife is really just a bridging unit, that, you know, an umbrella that we can use our influence to bring in experts with intelligence, but we can also bring in, you know, you can ask the Duke to request president, you know, backing, and prime ministers and things to come in, and we can also get law enforcement as well as the private sector. So we just see ourselves as a sort of a conduit for bringing all these key partners together. And the more we can do that, you know, the better we're going to be. So as I say, one of the priorities for the next few years is increasing membership in sort of specific areas. And so, yeah, I would really love to work on growing that in Asia.
Well, that's great, Rob. I think you're doing a great job. I hope the next 3 years are you know, really good for you in terms of whatever, you know, achieving whatever goals you've set for yourself. Rob, thanks for being here. And we are running out of time. So what we will do is email you some of the questions and then get back to the attendees with answers individually. So thanks a lot for your time. And I wish you and United for Wildlife the very best in your endeavors.
Brilliant. Thank you for having me. And yeah, hopefully we'll all collaborate soon.